We're at the end of an empire right now. It is the end. It's the end of this. And all empires always come to an end. The Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, Chinese were the earliest. So what we're looking at today is the end of the American Empire. So it's a very dangerous time. It's explosive, with Palestine and Gaza. All the stuff that's going on is an end of times. Not biblical, but just an end of an era. And the trouble when this comes to an end, war follows. That's what I'm afraid of.
The American Empire is over. We're done. We peaked about 12, 15 years ago, and we are on a down. And it's very hard for the American people, which I understand. I am one. It's hard to get your head around that. We've had a century of on the way up, which is a lot more fun than on the way down. But it does happen to every empire. We're only the latest. Look at the British, how far they've fallen. We're in that process. So the problem with the trickle down is, yeah, there might be more jobs, but they're going to be created in China. They're going to be created in Brazil. They're going to be created in India. They're not created here.
U.S. News won't show you this, but I will. For the first time ever, more countries around the world viewed the U.S. negatively than positively. Want to guess why? The 2025 Democracy Perception Index surveyed over 110,000 people in 100 different countries, and the results are not great for the U.S. America's global image has collapsed. In fact, even China is viewed more positively than the United States around the world. The U.S. dropped from 22% approval rating last year to negative 5% this year. According to this index, Donald Trump is the least liked public figure. Only 27% of the people polled view him positively, even ranking below Vladimir Putin. And when asked why, former NATO Security General said, "It's no surprise that opinions have slipped, even among people like me who have spent their lives admiring the United States and what it stood for." He then went on to say that America's credibility is collapsing, and the reason is Donald Trump. He cited Trump's trade wars, bullying allies, engaging in, quote, chaotic diplomacy. And he's right. Sadly, the U.S. is no longer the democratic model to follow.
Does the world really need more America? Well, I think if you look at our country over the past 4 years especially, you can see that our reputation on the global stage has decreased significantly. I don't think our efforts around the world has really made a world a better place. I think right now the world probably needs less of America, and I think America really needs to focus inwardly and focus on improving themselves.
The America First policy approach is notably unpopular outside the country where it's carried out. So one of the things that we saw in the Nation Brands Index was that during the time of the first Trump presidency, the US lost 5.2% of its brand image during that period. Now, 5.2% doesn't sound like a big deal, but bear in mind that the average for all the other countries we measure is actually plus 0.46.
What are the actual effects that you see with the country's brand seemingly worsening?
We hear the headlines. We hear about boycotts of products. So if a country invades another country and makes itself deeply unpopular in the short term, then you will sometimes hear about a large number of people refusing to buy products from that country. But actually, it's not only in those circumstances. All the time, consumers around the world, without even realizing they're doing it, will make choices about which countries' products they're buying.
So America's global dominance was never just about military power, even though that is what many people might know the US for. But it was actually built on, alliances, diplomacy, and strategic economic ties that actually made the US appear like the center of, global world trade. But today, what we are seeing is that the system is collapsing from within, because Donald Trump is actually trying to convince his followers and many Americans that America is getting robbed by their partners, by their own allies, and that is not the worst part. The worst part is his solution to that problem. He identifies that as a problem, and his solution is isolation, cutting America off from the rest of the world. And in a very globalized world like we are in today, isolation is not strength. It's actually diplomatically and economically, suicidal. because where in the past leaders and America used charm, partnerships and like security guarantees to build influence, outside of its borders, Trump is kind of like doing the opposite. He's alienating their own allies, attacking long-term trade partners of the US and walking away from international forums where the US was always known to lead the conversation, from skipping from summits to threatening sovereign states like Canada, Greenland, to openly even insulting NATO allies. And Trump's diplomacy is rather a bit reckless and very unstable. And the consequences, if you can observe clearly, they are hitting America and Americans harder than anyone else.
There's a saying that I really like that helps to really quickly summarize all of the high points and all of the low points of world history. That helps to explain why no great empire has ever managed to maintain its strength forever and has managed to maintain progress forever, but instead every great human empire has always backpedaled and eventually been destroyed, or more often has destroyed itself. And that saying goes like this: hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. In the United States of America right now, it increasingly seems like we are in the last phase of that progression, where good times have created weak men, and now weak men seem to either be intentionally or not creating hard times. And really, the American century, for all intents and purposes, might already be over. And it's all because of a couple of decisions that were made over the course of just a couple of weeks that have irrevocably destroyed trust in the United States of America and have destroyed the pillars that made the United States so wealthy and so powerful to begin with. Right now, changes are happening so rapidly that most Americans are not even aware of them yet. And I think I am one of the exceptions because I have this YouTube channel which allows me to interact with a majority audience that is Europeans or people from other parts of the world. And that audience gives me a lens into how the rest of the world actually thinks right now that most Americans may not see for several months or maybe even several years. But that view that I am seeing is very palpable within the past month or so. A massive change in sentiment of people, citizens of other nations, towards the United States. People increasingly not only do not trust the United States anymore, but they actively distrust us and no longer want to be in our sphere of influence. And what we're seeing, which I'll describe in a few parts throughout this video, is really a new multipolar world that seems to be forming very rapidly to replace the hole that U.S. influence is creating. Right now, those signs are small. Perhaps this is reversible, but probably not if the decisions that are being made continue to be made. So let me explain a little bit what's going on. First, let's start with a quick summary of the foundations of power that have over the past century made the United States the most powerful and the wealthiest nation in human history. And then I want to explain how the United States is now actively kicking out those pillars of power from beneath their own feet. All empires throughout all of human history have gained power on two major pillars. The first is military dominance, and the second is world trade. And pretty much without exception, any nation that wanted to be great throughout history pursued those two objectives in a number of different ways. Sometimes those objectives manifested themselves more peacefully, where the people that were basically being subject to that nation or that empire were more or less happy about the outcome. Often the nations that were subjected to the power of that empire weren't happy, and it just depended on how things played out. The United States, of course, as the most powerful nation in the world right now, is no exception to those two rules. And really, over the past century, the primary reason the United States has gotten so wealthy and so powerful is because they intentionally set out to be a global country. They did this in a way that is arguably different than any other empire in human history, but nevertheless, they did it. Where over the past 100 years, and especially in the period following World War II, the United States explicitly pursued a strategy of globalism. We wanted the wealth and the goods of all the nations around the world, and to help protect those interests, we built a massive military with military bases all over the place. And in particular, we built an extremely powerful global navy. Now, we use this military and this navy differently than most empires did prior to us, which is we sought primarily to protect other nations, to keep people within our sphere of influence so that they would willingly want to work with us and willingly trade with us and allow us to reap the benefits. But one way or another, the United States got wealthy because of military dominance and because of global trade. However, over the past couple of decades, it has become increasingly clear that Americans do not understand this basic set of facts, and they have begun to actively work against these interests, seeing America's globalism as a cost center rather than a benefit center, seeing our need to be interconnected with the world as something that is taking away from us rather than something that is adding to us. Why we feel this way, it's difficult to say. Perhaps it's just because we have so much wealth that we're spending so much time consuming that wealth that we don't spend any time reading books or reading our own history to understand where we came from. And increasingly, we have seen a certain segment of the United States wanting to withdraw from this world order, even though the United States is the one who created the world order, and they created it primarily for their own benefit. We have seen that manifest itself since Donald Trump has taken office for the second time in a very explicit way. Donald Trump has come into office and he has made several different statements and several different moves that all separately could have undermined the United States' position in the world order, and combined, they definitely are pushing other nations away from us. These include combinations of things like saying that we want to take Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada, stuff that sounds like it should be made up or people putting words in Trump's mouth that he never said. But all of these things have been explicitly marked as goals by Donald Trump, and they're things that he has repeated several times, and it's clear that he is trying to move towards these goals as a matter of policy. On top of all of that, Trump has come out of the gate attempting to put tariffs on all of the United States' major trading partners between Canada and China and Mexico, about half of U.S. global trade, although he has backed out a couple of times after he's realized that these policies are devastating towards the United States' own economy. And then finally, Donald Trump has, at least as of now, paused military aid towards Ukraine and has made a move that really changes directions from decades of U.S. foreign policy. Now, as I said, all of these things are working together to undermine the two major pillars that have made the United States so wealthy and powerful, that being military dominance and global trade. I keep repeating those because I just really want to hammer the point home. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just being repetitive for no reason. Obviously, things like tariffs undermine the United States' global position in trade because they completely reverse course on what was the goal of the United States in trade for several decades, and in what, in fact, has been the goal of every great global empire throughout human history, which was to receive more goods from other countries than you had to give yourself. It's called a trade deficit, and it's not a bad thing. It's actually been the goal of human empires since human empires were first conceived. But now the United States is trying to make goods, cheap goods from other countries, more expensive on purpose so that they can do the hard work of producing and they can pay higher prices. It doesn't make much sense, especially from a historical standpoint, but it's what they're doing. Now, in addition to that, from a military standpoint, the United States is undermining the military dominance that made so many nations want to trade with them in the first place. Of course, again, when we look at global empires have always tried to use their military to get more trade with other nations in one of two ways. One was the colony way, which was let's go and actually physically take territory and protect it and use the military to protect our interests to force the people who live there to send goods back to the home country. But there's another way where you can get the people to do that for you willingly by using your military to help protect them. And then because they are grateful for your protection, they are willing to live within your sphere of influence. That is the strategy that the United States has been pursuing, and now they're undermining that in two major ways. The first is obvious, where the United States for many decades has been willing to engage in warfare to protect the nations that are their friends and allies. We now see the United States backing away from Ukraine and actually being a little bit belligerent about their responsibility as the leading global power, saying that they don't want the costs of engaging in warfare or even supporting another nation while they engage in warfare. They just want the benefits of being a global empire. They don't want the responsibilities. At the same time, the United States is making statements that are at least making other countries nervous that they are shifting from the protection kind of empire to just the straight up take by force kind of empire. We see the United States saying things like, let's take the Panama Canal, let's take Greenland, let's make Canada the 51st state. And that is making people nervous about the United States' intentions. And it is causing them to back more and more away from U.S. influence. And they're not so willing to do it from their heart now. It's getting to the point where the United States might actually have to force them to do it, which they won't be very successful at. We see, for example, as the United States goes after Canada with tariffs, a huge buy Canadian and buy European movement is starting in Canada because people no longer want to trade with or trust the United States any longer. And we see similar things happening in Europe. And so with just a couple of moves, we have undermined the foundations of our empire. What might happen next? Well, obviously, it is too soon to say exactly where things could ultimately go, but there are some signals of what is already happening. And one of the first signals is that in the wake of all of these decisions, the Swiss government, which was in negotiations for a contract to buy F-35s from the United States, now has a lot of voices in their parliament that are saying they're not sure if they want to make a deal for their own protection that relies on the United States. And we might see a lot more things like this happening. Because when the United States shows that at the flip of a hat, at the flip of an administration, they can completely change their interests and change the way they look at the world, nations aren't going to want to be dependent on us for major weapons systems that require training and parts and maintenance from the United States. Now, that might seem like a small thing, but it's not a small thing at all if that trend opens up and broadens up. Because one of the reasons the United States continues to be the most powerful military on the planet is because of the power we get by selling our military systems to other countries. Military systems, of course, like any other kind of technology, are very expensive to develop, and the main cost is in the research and development, not the production of individual units. So for a long time, the way that the United States has funded our own military is by building up this global trust and getting people to want to buy our weapons from us, which reduces the cost of us developing our weapons by allowing us to spread those costs among other nations. That's part of what has allowed our military to become so technologically advanced, because we can afford to do that because we have a global system that we sit at the top of that is built primarily on trust. With that trust broken, people are going to look to purchase weapon systems from other countries. That is going to increase the cost of weapons development, not just for us, but for everybody else who was in our sphere of influence. While our adversaries are not going to have the same problems. And it is going to erode our military edge that to this point has kept us head and shoulders above China. This is just one thing that could happen, and it's one example of how bad things can get. Now, the really sad part is that a large reason that this could happen and that trends are going to move in this direction is because the United States was so upset about how much money they were spending giving weapons to Ukraine that they decided to basically back out of those deliveries with no notice to Ukraine, and now the trust is broken. But the massive irony is that over the course of over 3 years, the United States has given less equipment in terms of monetary value to Ukraine than they sell on an annual basis to other countries around the world. In fact, less than half. So over the course of 3 years, we've given Ukraine a little bit over $100 billion worth of equipment. Every year, we sell approximately $215 billion, or maybe it's $285 billion, I can't remember the exact number, dollars worth of military equipment to other countries. And now, because we didn't want to keep up that aid, other countries are trusting us less and are now looking to develop their own systems rather than buying from us. So it's one of these situations where the United States is being penny wise and pound foolish, stepping over dollars to pick up nickels. Basically, because we don't want to give a little bit of money away, we have jeopardized a very profitable and a very strategically important industry. And again, this is just one example of what is happening now that the United States has undermined its global trust across the rest of the world. Now, what we tell the media is that the reason that we are doing all of these things is that we are trying to protect American interests. And when it comes to Ukraine, we say we're trying to avoid World War III. But there's a lot of ironies in all of these claims. First of all, World War III has already been avoided, and it was during the Cold War when the United States had a massive adversary in the Soviet Union and a massive nuclear arms race. At that time, World War III was avoided not because the United States backed down, but because the United States stood up and unified with its European partners, creating something called NATO. Maybe you've heard about it. NATO is a very important institution that kept the world out of war through strength, by showing our enemies that if they wanted war, it would be too costly for them. And because of those actions, our enemies didn't pursue war. But now we see the United States taking actions that show that they may want to back away from NATO. They are pretty belligerent about NATO growing in power, even though, again, that is what kept the world out of war over the past several decades. Now, on top of all of that, we see the United States making these bizarre statements about Greenland and how we need to possess Greenland because of its strategic importance, apparently not realizing that we can already possess all of the strategic importance of Greenland without having to take it from anybody, just by continuing to support and uphold the world order that we worked so hard to create. The United States, of course, historically has had military bases on Greenland, even though it isn't our own territory. Because we have been part of this international community, that nation has been more than willing to invite the United States to take part in being on Greenland and use the island for its strategic position without the United States having to take it over. Now we see the United States saying we want to take it, we want it to be given to us, whatever, one way or another, we're going to get it, while at the same time saying that they want to back away from NATO. And again, we see this move from the old kind of empire that the United States was, the better kind, the kind that protected global interests in partnership with other nations, to basically saying, well, we want to do things on our own. We don't want to have to be involved in other nations at all. Again, we want all the benefits. We want none of the costs. But here's the problem, America. When we don't pay the costs, when we don't pay the bills for the world that has made us so prosperous, we don't get to keep the benefits. The world is going to back away from us if we continue to act like that. And so it is up to us to change the narrative, to read our own history books, to realize where we came from, and to turn things around before it's too late. Now, this can be done. Already, 2 different times, Donald Trump has indeed backed down on his tariff threats against Mexico and Canada, in part because he was forced to see the reality of the debilitating economic effects this would have on his own nation, and in part because brave voices within his own party stood up and told him the truth, and he finally listened for a rare, brief moment. In order to turn this ship around, all conservatives need to do is embrace the voices that their party was not ashamed to speak in the past. Ronald Reagan, of course, was a big conservative, one of the most conservative presidents we ever had, who upheld these 2 pillars of American global influence. And now we see those who would speak along the same lines as Reagan, afraid to do so because they are terrified of being labeled as a liberal or a neocon just for disagreeing with Donald Trump. But the reality is that you are not a neocon if you do that. Those who would shut you down for doing that, they are the new conservatives. They are the neocons. They are the ones trying to change the narrative and take over what used to be a good party for their own purposes. You can win. You just have to be brave enough to speak up.
Now, so Trump isolationist policies are actually weakening America from every front, be it in diplomacy, in trade, and even in as basic as agriculture. We can see. If we start with trade, for example, China used to be America's biggest buyer of many products. But let's talk about specifically soybeans. You know, China has always been the biggest market of American soybeans. But Trump decided to push them away with tariffs and political hostility at some point. And then what happened next? China didn't suffer. They simply just turned to, other suppliers in Brazil and Argentina. And American farmers of the soybean, their silos are full, their prices crashing, and they're begging for federal support. They have been begging for several months for federal support. Yet Trump continues to ignore that. Yet, so Trump claims to be punishing China, that China is going to pay and foot the bills for the tariffs. But the only people paying the price are the everyday Americans, especially the farmers who once really supported him the most, ironically. So then there is diplomacy. America used to lead in global corporations, or maybe still leads in many global corporations. The country, was always at the table shaping international decisions, But Trump, first of all, just the other week, he chose to skip the G20 summit that was held in South Africa. And he continues to push for the US to pull out from multilateral agreements, the UN, he threatens the UN, the World Health Organization, the USID, and he tells Americans and his followers that these corporations are extorting America. But what he doesn't understand, or he doesn't tell his followers, is the fact that these multilaterals and these organizations, in as much as they look like they're supporting other countries overseas, but they go a long way in securing American interest overseas. Because the moment the US is offering some kind of help, then countries always feel, the obligation to work and trade and to listen and to follow, the US. So this kind of help is usually not just help, it is tied with the benefits that also America enjoys at a diplomatic, at trade, at different levels, and even politically, militarily. And he also doesn't show a lot of respect diplomatically for US allies and US neighbors. Look at the general relation now between the US and Canada, for example, their nearest neighbor to the north, and Mexico to the south, and many other countries in Europe, from their tourists and students and scholars being detained for days on end without reason and without trial, to just even threatening to seize a sovereign state like Canada and make it, a state. This makes the US look a little too unstable and dangerous, and not just for foreigners and other countries, but even for Americans themselves. Many citizens in America are, starting to fear that the country is actually drifting into political instability and eventually global irrelevance, And actually, here is the bigger picture, Empires always rise, they peak, and eventually they fall. Every time the empire did collapse, it was not even because of forces from outside, especially a big empire. It was because of poor leadership, turned inwards, isolated itself, cut itself off, from relationships, from trade, from the rest of the world. And that is usually what sustains the power that, an empire has. You can look at what happened to the greatest empires. Rome did it. Britain did it. And now what we are seeing is that America is, on the same road. So Trump's foreign policy is a proof that when a country stops engaging with the world, what happens is that the world simply just moves on without it. The world will not collapse. The America will collapse, and then the world will shift, realign, and just move on. You know what happens is that Brazil will step in, China will step in, Africa will even step in. Like new centers, power centers, suddenly begin to emerge. So what we are actually witnessing is probably not a very sudden fall, like it appears. It's a slow motion decline by deliberate policies and decisions like isolation, cutting off from a globalized world instead of thinking of how to overtake those that are now doing it so well, like China, in terms of taking over global influence. They're choosing to now cut themselves, away from the rest of the world. And unless America really reverses course, the gap between the US and the rest of the world will continue to widen and grow, bigger by the day, simply. So if you found this a bit insightful, make sure you like and, you share and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done that. So tell me in the comments if you think that America is already in decline, has been in decline, or it's just the beginning of everything else. I'll see you in the next video.